Hey there, it's Corey here. And before we jump into today's episode, I've got something exciting to share. If you've been enjoying these deep dives into the future of family enterprises, you'll definitely want to join us for the next Legacy Builders Live webcast, happening July 18th. I'll be joined by Jerry Meyer and Gavin Brower. You might recognize them from episodes 13 and 22. Together, we'll explore people, power, and priorities, rewiring the family enterprise for a smoother transition, with insights on generational roles, cultural alignment, leadership behavior, and how to support non-family executives while strengthening trust and clarity across the system. If you missed our June 12th webcast with Cindy Redoux and Leah Tolton, the full replay is available now. To register for the upcoming session or catch up on past episodes, visit legacybuilderswebcast.com. That's legacybuilderswebcast.com. I hope to see you there. Now, let's dive into today's episode. Welcome to Legacy Builders, Strategies for Building Successful Family Enterprises, brought to you by Beacon Family Office at Asante Financial Management Limited. I'm your host, Corey Gagnon, Senior Wealth Advisor, and on this show, we explore global ideas, concepts, and models that help family enterprises better navigate the complexities of family wealth. Today, we welcome Don Steele, CEO and founder of Sterling Family Capital, a trusted advisor who bridges the worlds of financial strategy and family enterprise. Don brings a unique passion for helping entrepreneurial families unlock potential across both their businesses and their legacies. As a valued partner and skilled collaborator, he remains deeply engaged with enterprising families and their advisory teams, focusing on preserving and nurturing each family's distinctive blend of financial and non-financial capital. Don serves families across Canada, combining technical proficiency with an intimate understanding of the complex challenges facing multi-generational wealth. My goal is to be the most curious person in today's conversation with Don Steele, where we explore how entrepreneurial families can reframe their businesses as financial assets rather than operational burdens. We'll unpack the concept of separating ownership from management and why this distinction is key to sustaining both family harmony and enterprise value. You'll hear how collaborative decision-making, long-term thinking, and strategic structure can help families simplify complexity and build wealth that lasts across generations. Now, let's dive in. Welcome, Don. We're excited to have you here today to share your wealth of knowledge and experiences with us. Let's dive in, shall we?
Love to.
Don, imagine you're delivering the commencement speech to the graduating class of 2025, and you have the chance to inspire them with your story. How would you begin your speech to convey the incredible lessons and expertise that you've gained along your career?
Corey, I got to say, this is such a great question, and it mentally transports me back to my own commencement. And so I'm channeling a little bit of talking to my younger self here. And the thing that occurs to me is that in the next 10 years, and you don't necessarily know this at the time, but in the next 10 years, you're talking to people who are around 20 years of age. And up until this point in their lives, they've been really in a world where they are told what to learn, what to think about, how to be. And in the next 10 years, they have an opportunity to set their trajectory for the rest of their lives. So with that in mind, I thought there are three things that are really important to do. And the three things are to take the time to understand themselves, challenge yourself in the things that you undertake, and thirdly, to find and engage mentors or guides who have traveled similar paths. And let me just unpack each of those three a little bit. So the first one, taking the time to understand yourself. I guess the point here is that it does take time. And some young adults may have a pretty good handle on who they are as people and where they're going by the time they graduate. Many don't. And it's important, I think, to take that time in their 20s to think about where their passion lies and to allow themselves the space to be guided by their intuition and curiosity and really to look for their passion. I think it's critically important to find your passion in life. We all go through difficult, challenging times, and almost invariably, it is passion in large part that keeps us moving forward. It's a lot of other things. It's the people we know, it's our families, our friends. But our passion, particularly in our careers, our passion is the thing that propels us forward when the going gets tough. And picking up on that theme of when the going gets tough, as you explore during your 20s, challenge yourself in the things that you undertake. Stretch yourself. Be honest with yourself about what you're good at and what you're not so good at and why. Learn to expect and accept that occasionally you will fail, but make it your business to learn from those failures. And as you fail and become more self-aware, and this is critically important, don't be afraid to change course. The worst thing I could ever imagine for somebody is to see them put themselves on a path early in their adult years and slavishly stick to that path when other things may have excited them and drawn them in a different direction, and for them to have ignored that. So I think it's really important to give yourself the ability to change paths. The third thing is to find and engage mentors or guides, people who have traveled the same or similar paths to the ones that you're contemplating. As young adults, we often don't realize how willing people who have gone before us are to allow us to learn from their experience. In my life, I've been very fortunate to have some phenomenal mentors. And one of the things that I learned about the mentor relationship is that you have to come to it as an active participant. You can't engage a mentor and then just ask them what you're supposed to do. You need to show up with energy and actually interact with your mentor and ask for guidance when you need it. But really, it's about you propelling yourself forward.
Fantastic, Don. Wow. Now, when you talk about time to understand yourself, I love the idea of intuition and how often people don't listen to that. Anything that you can shed light on where maybe that those first steps that somebody can really say, yes, this is my intuition. Like this isn't, a bad calling or maybe it's not heartburn. Something's telling me this is right or this is wrong.
Oh, that's a great question. I would say that, particularly at that stage of our lives, intuition shows up as whispers, things that you haven't been thinking about because they're below the surface, but they're things that you're drawn to. They're questions that appear in your mind, and you don't quite know why you want to get the answer, but you allow yourself to pursue them. As I say, in our first 20 years of our lives, we're going through school and we're largely being taught from a curriculum that's standardized. When we get beyond that, as you go to university, you have more choice in what you study, but it's those quieter things that really don't show up in the curriculum that, for example, a sense of service or a sense of duty or helping others. These are intuitive things that show up really outside of the classroom that we see in our lives, a sensitivity to maybe the quieter voices in the room, an interest in connecting dots, which is something that I became aware of very gradually. It's not something that's taught, but as your life progresses, it becomes very important to develop that intuitive sense of what you're good at and what you're drawn to.
Right. And What about talking to somebody who's maybe further along their life path? Maybe they've gone through things and, maybe they're now at that tough place that you talked about. And maybe they haven't developed some of those passions. Maybe some of those passions or efforts have been, putting their love and sweat and tears into building the enterprise that they have. And maybe they're now, holding that wealth and times have gotten tough. Maybe not in a business sense, but life is throwing some curveballs. What do you think that, talking to that person that they could do in that position?
Well, I think that life has a way of drawing people into exactly that kind of situation. And let's back up a little bit and talk about how we get there and then how we can navigate our way out. I think one of the things that I encounter in my practice is I use this metaphor of a log jam where, life consists of a bunch of logs and they're all flowing downstream. And at some point, the water gets a little shallow or, the banks narrow and something binds. Something catches on the bottom and stops that one log. Well, then the next log coming down after it tend to get tangled up in it. And before long, you've got a whole bunch of things bound together. And it's challenging to deal with all of that complexity at once. And so for somebody who finds themselves in a place like that, and it may have, as you say, it may have nothing to do directly with the business. The business may be firing on all cylinders, but in the background, you've got questions about ownership and management succession. You've got questions of what kind of people your children are growing up to be. If the business has been very successful, are there entitlement issues that have kind of crept into the picture and are creating complexity and angst? And so you're stuck with this logjam. And really, the most effective way of dealing with that is stopping and studying what we've got, understanding all of the interrelationships that have created this blockage, and then skillfully and intentionally disentangling things so that we can get the logs moving downstream sort of in parallel. Nice metaphor, easier to say, much more difficult to do. But I would say it starts with, first of all, the humility of being able to acknowledge that you need help.
Right.
You need help figuring this stuff out and asking for help. And then, then there's a question of who comes in to help you with that. And it's, I would say, with many of these issues, it's rarely one person. And I think this is kind of the foundation of the practice that I started. As you know, I was a banker for many years. And while a bank is a big, complex organization, that complexity has similarities to things that you see in a family business. You have technical issues, you have personnel issues, you have leadership challenges. And while it's not directly applicable to the family enterprise space, there are themes that you can draw on and bring to this ecosystem. And one of the things that my banking career really taught me is the power of collaboration and the power of being selfless, leaving your ego at the door, understanding your lane, and bringing a team together of like-minded people together with a view to first listen and understand the problem and then co-create a solution with whoever the owner of the problem is. And so in a family enterprise space, this really was the genesis of the collaborative mindset that I've built my practice on. So it really is helping business owners disentangle the issue and then purposefully and sequentially work on a solution.
And Don, thinking of what you've just explained of the team working together, in a lot of ways, our listeners, they become successful through many methodologies. I think that there's a lot that would be in common, but a lot of it would probably be just that strong sense, that grit that, they've been working hard. And, to build something of significance, they really need to understand how to multiply their efforts. And so they probably haven't been doing it alone. But in a lot of senses, they've had a problem and they've hired somebody for it. And what you're saying now is instead of hiring somebody for it, let's bring a team together. And so the work that you do, how do you see that team not only created, but what does the life of that team look like? Are they with the family for a long period? Are they working with one person? How does it begin and exist and end?
It's a wonderful question, the answer to which will vary by family. And so the process is one that will be familiar to many of your listeners. It's a discovery process that, as you might expect, it encompasses the three circle model, a deep dive on the individual and how they fit into the family system and the business and the ownership systems, so that we have at least an understanding of the main components, the logs, if you will, in the log jam. Then, the family or the business owner is really the driver of our action. Part of my job is to illuminate the themes for the family, but also to lay out some of the potential paths that we could take. But then it's up to them to decide which direction they want to go. And based on that, it's a matter of engaging the right team. And so, for example, oftentimes I'll come in when a transition of a business from G1 to G2 is contemplated. And the presumption is often that G2 will take over the business. And what's interesting, I wouldn't say it happens most of the time, but it happens enough of the time that it's significant. When you get members of G2 alone in a room and you start talking to them about their vision for their own lives and where they want to go, often doesn't include taking over the business. And so all of a sudden your game plan has changed. So now the goal is to prepare a business for sale or to evolve the business into something else that is more in line with the shared passion or objectives of G2. And that implies a different team. So the first stage is a lot of thoughtful listening and the ability to tap in and identify themes and translate those themes into what a project team would look like. But then forming that team, which may or may not include advisors who are already in the orbit of the family. Where they're not, my role is to have a network of suitable advisors available so that the family can select one that they feel works best with them. And then really to project manage with the family to identify we've got a vision for the future now, or a vision taking shape, and a strategy that would extend out 3 to 5 years, but then becoming more tactical as we, in the 1 year time frame, and then breaking it down so that what falls out is a project.
Right.
And so then it's a matter of bringing real project management expertise to bear on the situation. And so you asked, what does the team look like? The broader team may be multifaceted. There may be a team around the family. There may be a team around the business. My role is to coordinate and to help in certain areas where I have the technical expertise. But the key is really bringing that project management expertise to the issue so that we can disentangle the logs, get the family moving down the path that they have identified as the one that they want to pursue, prepare a business for transition of some sort, which implies a number of other things, and move forward in sort of 90-day sprints so that we're gradually making progress. We're moving the ball down the field or moving different balls down multiple fields if that's what's needed. But it's really just chunking things down into manageable pieces and then building the capability in the family, in the business, and in time in that ownership group, which may be distinct from the management of the business.
Absolutely.
And building execution capability so that you're actually achieving the things little by little that are going to get you where you need to go.
Right. And Don, thinking of your metaphor of a log jam, I think of kind of three different ways that we could deal with that log jam. And I love that you're analyzing and looking at how do we dislodge this. I think of two other ways. One is we could use dynamite. We could just blow the whole thing up. And, often we see people revert to that and, relationships in carnage because of decisions made. But then I think of, well, what if you just add more water? And in a lot of situations, we see this with families. Instead of add more water, you just add money. Money will solve lots of problems, but it really doesn't deal with the logjam. It just moves it down the river a little bit.
Or it breaks apart in ways that you don't anticipate.
Yes. And so, where do you see adding more money creating solutions? Because I think it does in some sense, but also adding just more problems.
Adding more money, creating solutions. The first thing that leaps to mind is this is often the case when you're moving from one generation to the next. The way families grow, the math requires that a business that's supporting these families grow at a commensurate rate. And just reinvesting in typical 60/40 portfolio is not going to get you there. You have to figure out how to create that capacity to regenerate capital in successive generations. And one of the things that I learned in my banking career is that when you hear the word in our business, when you hear the word capital, your mind automatically goes to financial capital. But what I realized, particularly when I was doing M&A work, is that it is never initially about the financial capital. Financial capital is always a derivative of human capital, intellectual capital, social capital, and some magical combination of that allows you to create a successful business that drives the growth and regeneration of capital in such a way that successive generations can be supported by a growing business. So adding money, adding more financial capital by taking on debt or bringing in private equity or another investor, that's one way, but you've got to remain focused on developing the capacity of that successive generation to run and grow the business. I work with banks and other investors where it's appropriate to bring in additional money to help grow a business. But the key is really to help that next generation understand how to grow the business, both organically and by acquisition.
And Don, you mentioned developing capacity in the next generation. In your experience, what's the biggest structural challenge families face as they try to build that capacity across generations?
There's one theme that is kind of central to the way I think about family enterprises, and it gets back to the three circle model and how it's the notion that the way we not often see the three circle model is as three distinct but connected circles. And I realized early in the game that usually doesn't start that way. The circles often start stacked right on top of one another. Either the family is on top or the business is on top, and they gradually separate as people arrive in those systems, in the family as children arrive, and business as employers are hired. And so the separation of those two circles doesn't entirely take care of itself and does need to be managed, but it happens. What is more challenging is to pull that ownership circle out from under the business circle, because as we know, in many family businesses, ownership and management are synonymous.
Yep.
But as a business grows and becomes more successful, it goes through this evolution where the value of the business is initially the concept in the mind of the founder. And then assets are purchased, and for a time, the value of the business is tied to the value of those assets. But in time, and as the business becomes bigger and more complex and more successful, it becomes a financial asset. And one of the key things that I find is that there's no natural force working alongside family businesses that teaches them how to think of that business as a financial asset where the value is based on cash flows and the risk associated with those cash flows. So a lot of my work is sort of aimed at developing that lens that a family can look through its own business. And what I've found is that if you can do that, then the things that we did talk about, the capability of regenerating wealth, becomes so much, well, I wouldn't say easier, but so much more achievable because you've given them a way of thinking about things that, it started with their own business, but now they can apply that to other investments that they might make, either to diversify the overall family enterprise portfolio or to grow the legacy business.
Yeah. And I think one more thing on that, Don, and you and I have been connected through this, and other guests have commented, and we've covered it deeply, is the skill set required to be somebody who's in the business, the leadership and management versus what it takes to be a good owner and the skill set there. So as you talked about those two circles separating, there's very much a different skill set involved in being in those two circles.
And I would say humility too, because certainly while you are still the owner manager, it takes a lot of courage to step out of the business and look back at yourself as a manager and assess your capabilities as a manager, the ability to put on those different hats. It's not an easy thing to do.
Absolutely. Yes. Now, thinking about the evolution you just described, how do you help families align their vision and principles with maybe a new strategy that they haven't previously employed? You talked about using debt, bringing on an outside investor. How did they become comfortable with that if it's been just slugging away and compounding capital that's been in the business for a long time? Where do you start?
That's a great question. Let's start with debt. Oftentimes, what I encounter in first generation businesses is a reticence to borrow. And the reasons for that may have some basis in experience, a bad experience with debt. Either somebody in the family got into trouble with debt, or there's just a philosophy that borrowing is a bad thing to do. But in a business, debt is actually the lowest cost form of capital. And so there is often a very good reason to use debt prudently, but that requires that you understand the financial side of your business at a reasonably sophisticated level. You need to know what cash flow the business is generating so that you can place a ceiling on the amount of debt that you're prepared to bring into it. Equity as a source of capital is a different animal because equity holders, if you bring in sort of private equity or other equity investors, they're going to require at least a seat on the board, likely, and therefore some say in the management of the business. And so it really becomes a question of how much a family is willing to share their control of the business. So the private equity space is becoming much more attuned to how to work with family businesses and how to develop the expertise in family businesses. There's a growing number of private equity investors who are actually very effective partners. So it's an area that's growing, but it still is a challenge with families to take something that they have built from the ground up and then begin to share ownership and decision-making authority around it.
Absolutely. And Don, I want to go back to mentors and guides in life. Maybe not just in that talking to the 20-year-old and the next 10 years, but really thinking about where do those guides show up in different journeys that people are on. So the conversation we're having around different forms of capital, and there's probably somebody who's done it successfully before. And so the knowledge and experience that you have from your banking days. Are there many others who can help families in that sense that aren't biased as they're trying to make an investment or give a loan out?
Surprisingly, I think there are retired executives or retired owners of family businesses who have stepped back from their own business, may or may not be in a position to provide capital. I think that makes for a little bit of a different dynamic if they're also an investor or a lender to the business because they've got skin in the game, which isn't a bad thing, but it's not always a good thing.
Absolutely.
But I think business owners will know their peers. And so they'll know of people who are available. I guess I've been very surprised at and happily surprised at how many folks are willing to share their expertise, particularly with young people. When it comes to scaling an existing or legacy business, this can take the shape of an advisory board
Absolutely. Yep.
who are essentially mentors to the collective management of the company. So it's a slightly more formalized structure, but there's certainly people out there who have scaled a business. It may not be in the same industry and may not even be in the same sector, but there are people out there that will have the expertise, and you can find them through many HR firms, HR consultancies will have lines into people who have recently retired because they've been involved in the executive search. So they're seeing the people who are stepping off and the people who are coming in. So they'll be aware of those sorts of people. So I've found that those HR firms are a good source of candidates for this type of work. But yeah, they're out there.
And you made a comment about being an active participant. So maybe it's not an advisory board, which is a very valuable tool and strategy to employ. But really talking about mentor, maybe it's not an advisory or a coaching relationship, but somebody really looking at somebody that they admire who's done it before them. What does that active participation look like?
Active as opposed to passive. So active, let's define what I mean by talking a little bit about what it's not. To me, an effective mentoring relationship is one that involves periodic and ongoing interaction, a dialogue, and ideally at or near the outset of the relationship, there are some defined goals. What is it that the mentee wants to get out of the relationship, hopes to get out of the relationship? And it has to be something more than, help me get my next job. It has to be something a little more impactful than that and long lasting than that. How do I, for example, I want to develop my strategic planning expertise, or I want to become a better leader and manager in the company. So the goal, which the mentee should have before even going out to look for a mentor, will inform the goals for the relationship. There's a discussion at the outset with the potential mentor and what they are able to bring to it, but it's really driven by the mentee, not the mentor. The mentor is not there to tell the mentee what they need to do. It's not the mentor's job to provide a laundry list or checklist of things that you need to do to get this. It's really to ask questions. I think a Socratic kind of a relationship where the mentor really asks questions that challenge the mentee and perhaps sets assignments to drive experience. I think that's the most key thing. But the responsibility for moving things forward really lies with the mentee. It's not the mentor's job to achieve the goals. It is the mentee's job to make sure that the objectives of the relationship are fulfilled.
Right. And thinking about, it might be dad's golf buddy that's the person that's coming forward. Is that the best person? Where are we looking?
It might be. If that's his or her only qualification to be the mentor, I tend to think not. I mean, there has to be something that if dad's golf buddy happens to be CEO or chief operating officer of a Fortune 500 company, well, maybe. But even then, it depends on what the objectives are. If the only reason is because they're a COO of a Fortune 500, well, maybe not. Again, it has to start with a clear definition, clear understanding on the part of the person seeking the mentor, what they really want to achieve out of this relationship. And quite frankly, I've personally had times in my career where I've had a couple of mentors for very distinct purposes, and that I found accelerated because you're learning on different dimensions concurrently. And in doing so, you're able to connect dots, like they feed on one another, right?
Yes.
And so finding an opportunity like that can be useful as well.
Love it. Don, as we near the end of our conversation today, there are a few questions that I ask each guest before we wrap up. Are you ready for the tough ones?
Only the tough ones, Corey.
All right. Now, what is one key strategy that you believe is most essential for building a successful family enterprise?
I love this question because there's so many levels that you can answer it on. So I'm going to answer it at a top level and then drill down a little. The answer is pretty simple, and it's to make a conscious decision that you're playing the long game and that the purpose of the family is to evolve as a system, or the family enterprise to evolve as a system. And that's, again, one of those things that's easy to say, but what does it actually mean? The purpose in saying committing to being in it for the long term is it can free families from artificial constraints. For example, that a legacy business is and will always be the only business this family is in. If your reference point, your North Star, is that you are, in air quotes, business of evolving over the long term, it frees you up from keeping a legacy business. It allows you to say, okay, well, look, let's listen to what G2 and even G3 has to say about where they want to go in their lives. And if it's not consistent or we can't evolve what we've got today into something that accomplishes that goal, let's begin to work on selling this business as a viable asset to another investor, creating a successful liquidity event, and then going off and investing in something else or in a portfolio of other things that are consistent with where the next generation goes. Because what you're trying to do is tap into the passion of succeeding generations. And while values will hopefully remain relatively constant, the passion that each generation and each individual within each generation brings may differ. And again, back to that math of the way that families grow, it will become more diverse.
Yes.
So acknowledge that and say that we understand that and we're going to work with that palette.
Yeah. I appreciate that one, Don, because as you say, it needs to be a vision, but that's the concept that we need to grow this capital to be able to support more and more households as we go, not we now have this liquidity event. So let's each take our respective piece and
Walk away.
spend it. Yeah.
Yeah. The other part of committing to the long term is that, and this is more subtle, but it energizes a collective will to do what it takes to thrive in the long term. And it kind of gets back to what you just said, is that if the founder or founders are rigid in what their vision can be, or what the vision for the future is going to be, chances are that at some point, as you go down the generations, there's going to be disengagement. When you say that we're in this for the long term, what then matters is those successive generations then matter, and you will activate their commitment to that longer term vision.
And what is the most common challenge that you see family enterprises encountering when it comes to wealth transition and generational continuity?
I would say it's either an unwillingness or an inability to take ownership of failure and learn from it. And I mean, life is, any life is a series of successes and failures. When we fail to learn from our failures, we often find ourselves repeating them. And it's tough because, especially when you're dealing with founders, it's a very lonely space up at the top. And Their energy that made them founders in the first place is also the energy that sometimes prevents them from not having all the answers. So finding the courage, the strength to be vulnerable, to say, this one, I don't know the answer here. And this one didn't work. This didn't fail. What can I take away from this to make myself successful? Or who do I need to pull in to the discussion to help me understand? So that's the biggest challenge. But the answer is kind of right around the corner. If you turn that failure into an opportunity to learn, then you get yourself back on the front foot.
Absolutely. With that humility. Absolutely. And Don, in your experience, what are the top three key qualities that successful family enterprise leaders possess?
Well, actually, you just said it. The first one is humility.
Yeah.
Is absolute, that humility to acknowledge that you don't have the answers. And why? Because humility does a lot of things, but one of the most important things humility does is that it creates space for curiosity. Because if you just acknowledge that I don't have all the answers, then it gives you the license to go out and say, okay, let me find the answers. This is important to me. I want to learn. And I think that finding the courage to ask questions, I think, is critically important. Second, and it's come up numerous times in the conversation, is passion. When I look at families and I sit with them and listen to them talk about their businesses, you hear this analogy a lot. It's like they're talking about their children.
Definitely.
And their love for what they do, the deeper meaning in what they have chosen to invest their time and often all of their financial resources in creating this thing. It is this desire they connect at a deeper level, and it's for them, it's building something greater than themselves. And I just find that really exciting. It's fantastic to be around people who can just see the passion. And from a business standpoint, that passion is the thing that will get you through the tough times. It will propel you, or it will at least prevent you from quitting when the going gets tough. The final thing is an execution mindset, like the idea that when you say you're going to do something, you do it.
Right.
And it's important because when leaders adopt that kind of a mindset, they're modeling accountability. The people that are following them are seeing right in front of them that when I say I'm going to do something, I do what needs to be done to get it done. And that just builds trust. So it becomes a kind of a virtuous circle.
Fantastic. And before we conclude our discussion, Don, I'd love to highlight any conversations that you're having, or maybe conversations that you're listening to, reading, watching, anything that you would like to share with our guests where they could expand their knowledge the way that you have.
Well, I think that in this corner of this ecosystem that I operate in, it's really important to be an integrative thinker, which means that you have to be able to understand and connect dots. So as a result of that, my reading list is pretty diverse. So like there are a few books that have been particularly impactful for me. One of them is a book I read a couple of years ago called Range by David Epstein. I've also read books on portfolio construction by David Swenson, and podcasts that I listen to, obviously this one. Also, there's a great podcast by Joe Riley called Private Capital that I like because it's diverse. It talks about the family office space, but he has such great interviewees on there. Purposeful Planning Path podcast is another great one. And another one that was introduced to me very recently is, I think it's called Built to Sell Radio, which is really just a series of stories of business owners and how they've managed to build and in some cases sell great businesses. So those are a few of the resources that I lean on.
Fantastic. And yes, Built to Sell is fantastic. John Warlow has been doing that one for, I think they're few hundred episodes now,
Yeah.
which has been great.
Yeah, I was surprised that that one has sort of flown under my radar for as long as it has, but I've started listening to it quite regularly.
Love it. Well, Don, thank you so much for taking the time to share your expertise and experiences with us today. I sure learned a lot from the insights that you shared, and it was incredibly valuable to me. And I know that our listeners will be grateful for the contribution you made to our episode.
Corey, absolutely my pleasure.
As we wrap up this episode, we invite you to reflect on the insightful conversation that Don and I had about family enterprises and how the three circles of family, business, and ownership evolve from stacked together to separate yet connected systems. Whether you're part of a family enterprise or provide consulting to family enterprises, Don's perspectives offer practical approaches to viewing your business as a financial investment and building collaborative teams to solve complex family challenges while creating lasting wealth. Throughout our discussion, Don highlighted the importance of developing a financial asset perspective and applying collaborative approaches to family enterprise challenges. His insights explored how project management discipline and intentional disentanglement can help families navigate the complexities that bind family, business, and ownership together. By developing this financial perspective, he emphasized the need for families to understand cash flows and risk while building the collaborative mindset necessary to regenerate capital in successive generations. Our conversation ultimately revealed how applying these systemic approaches can help family enterprises build businesses that can support these successive generations. For families seeking expertise in family enterprise advisory and collaborative wealth strategies, Don Steele at Sterling Family Capital is ready to help. We've included his contact information and additional resources in the show notes to support you on your journey. Thank you for joining me, Corey Gagnon, your host of Legacy Builders Podcast. It's my personal passion to explore with you these topics related to family wealth. If you enjoyed today's episode, you can subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your preferred podcast platform. And don't forget to share this episode with family, friends, and colleagues who you care about. If you'd like to help support this show, you can do so by leaving a rating and review. If you have any questions about anything shared on today's episode, or have topics you'd like us to dive deeper into in future episodes, please let us know by emailing beaconfamilyoffice@asante.com. That's beaconfamilyoffice@ASSANTE.com. Legacy Builders, Strategies for Building Successful Family Enterprises is brought to you by Beacon Family Office at Asante. Are you worried about losing what you've created and seeking ways to transition your wealth across generations? Beacon Family Office at Asante supports our clients transition their wealth while maintaining relationships. If you'd like to access more content we've created, you can visit us at beaconfamilyoffice.com or for more details on our services and book an initial call. Thanks again for listening, and until next episode, stay intentional about building your legacy. This program was prepared by Corey Gagnon, who is a senior wealth advisor with Beacon Family Office at Asante Financial Management Limited. This is not an official program of Asante Financial Management, and the statements and opinions expressed during this podcast are not necessarily those of Asante Financial Management. This show is intended for general information only and may not apply to all listeners or investors. Please obtain professional financial advice or contact us at beaconfamilyoffice@asante.com or visit beaconfamilyoffice.com to discuss your particular circumstances prior to acting on the information presented.